All right, well, let's go ahead and get started with this evening's program. So good evening and welcome to this evening's webinar to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of Maine's 4-year Climate Action Plan, Maine Won't Wait, to discuss the progress made so far in implementing the Climate Action Plan and the work that still needs to be done in the coming years. Of course, we would have loved to have been with you in person for this program, but we appreciate that you've joined us here online instead. I speak for everyone at NRCM when I say that we hope that you and your families are safe and healthy during these challenging times. My name is Todd Martin. I'm the Grassroots Outreach Coordinator here at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. NRCM is a nonprofit membership organization protecting, restoring, and conserving Maine's environment now and for future generations. For more than 63 years, NRCM has been protecting the places and the way of life that make Maine such a special place to live, work, and play. NRCM harnesses the power of the law, science, and the voices of more than 25,000 members and supporters who live in Maine and beyond. We have a staff of 26, and our office is in Augusta, just steps from the State House. The Natural Resources Council of Maine recognizes and honors the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac tribes of Maine, collectively the Wabanaki. Wabanaki translates into the people of the dawn. These tribes have stewarded Maine for generations, stretching back to before colonial settlers forcibly occupied the area we now call Maine. The NRCM office in Augusta is on the unceded territory of the Penobscot Indian Nation, and most of us at this event tonight are on unceded lands once overseen by the Wabanaki. As we discuss ongoing projects on this land, let us remember that this history and move forward with a commitment to justice and alignment with the tribes of Maine. So before we get started with our program, and I turn it over to Jack, just a couple quick reminders about the Zoom webinar platform that we're using this evening. First, this program is being recorded. Tomorrow, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to watch the recording, and we hope that you'll share that with friends who were unable to join us here tonight. Your video and your audio is disabled this evening by design, so you'll only be able to hear and see our presenters. But if you have a question for either Jack or Josh this evening, please type that question in the Q&A box, not the chat box, in the Q&A box, which is found at the lower ribbon of your Zoom screen. And we'll have plenty of time for questions later at the end of the program. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jack Shapiro, NRCM's Climate and Clean Energy Director. Take it away, Jack.
Awesome, thanks, Todd, and hello, everyone. It's so great to see everyone typing in where they're from all around the state. It's great to see people calling in from all over, and I am just really thrilled to join all of you here tonight to talk about the 1-year anniversary of Maine Won't Wait, but also just because I'm new in this role. I started here at NRCM in July, and it's been a whirlwind bunch of months getting up to speed with everything going on climate in Maine, and just really looking forward to talking a little bit about this anniversary, but also taking lots of questions from you all at the end of our program. I'm joined here tonight by Josh Caldwell, our Climate and Clean Energy Outreach Coordinator. And also on our team is Rebecca Schultz, our Senior Advocate for Climate and Clean Energy, but she wasn't able to join this evening. So our Climate and Energy program has 4 elements that I just want to outline for context for everyone. One piece of it is advancing statewide climate policy and building support for climate action across Maine. And then the other 3 are really targeted towards the specific sectors that we really need to transform to get to our climate and clean energy goals as a state. And that is, facilitating Maine's clean energy transition in the electric sector, promoting energy efficiency and carbon-free buildings, and accelerating towards a clean and accessible transportation future for Maine. And we're here tonight to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of Maine's Climate Action Plan, which encompasses all of those sectors and more. And before I go too much further, I wanted to do a quick poll so that we could learn a little bit more about who's on the line today. So Todd, I'm not sure if you can, oh, there it is, to throw that up there. I just love to know for folks how long you've been involved in climate and clean energy advocacy. If you're brand new, if this is the first climate call you've ever been on, that is great, welcome. But if you've been doing this kind of work or participating with NRCM or with other groups for years and years and years, we'd love to know that too. So while that poll is running, I am going to just go over the agenda that we have laid out for today. We are going to start. We're sort of doing the welcome and introductions now. We're going to start in a second by giving a little background on where we are on climate and Maine's role in solving the climate crisis, the importance of the Climate Council process and the Climate Action Plan and how that came to be. And then we're going to cover some of the progress we've seen over the past year, what still needs to be done and what to expect and how you can get involved in the months to come. But we'll also save a lot of time for questions because we really want to tailor this to what you all are interested in as well. So let's talk about the poll. Oh my goodness, we are talking to a very experienced group here. I think we can everyone see the poll? Can everyone see the poll results, Todd?
Yes, I should be able to.
Okay, all right. So we've got a couple of folks new, but almost half of the folks on have been doing this for more than 10 years. So all right, I'm going to gird my loins for the Q&A section of this. But this should be pretty fun tonight. So again, thanks everyone for joining. So with an experienced group like this, I don't have to tell anybody that the climate crisis is here, and we're seeing its impacts here in Maine already. Just this summer, we were breathing smoke from Western wildfires, and that was significantly impacting air quality out here. We have seen more extreme weather, floods, more extreme rainfall and flooding and more severe storms. And, again, with a group like this, don't need to spend a lot of time on the urgency of climate change. The picture that science paints for us is stark about the impacts that we are already seeing, which have been predicted for a long time, associated with warming from carbon emissions, but also that this crisis is going to get escalatingly worse the longer we fail to act. One of the big pieces that it's happening at the international level that many of you were probably following is the most recent international climate negotiations in Glasgow, Scotland, COP26, the 26th conference of parties for the big UN climate treaty. And there was some progress that was made at COP26 in Glasgow. There were some key agreements and commitments that were made on methane pollution, which is actually the source of half of the warming that we've seen so far. So a really critical piece of the puzzle. On deforestation, zero emission vehicles, and on finance. But clearly this is still by itself insufficient to solve the crisis. No one conference is going to solve climate change, and that was borne out by what we saw coming out of Glasgow. But I think on the optimistic side of that, what we saw based on the analysis of the commitments made in Glasgow is that our emissions trajectory as a globe is actually headed much more towards the realm of 3 degrees Celsius of warming, which is still deeply concerning and far above the 1.5 degrees that science sort of tells us is necessary to really reduce the risk of some of the most catastrophic impacts. But we're headed a lot closer to that than we were about 5 or 6 years ago, when many projections had us headed towards 4, 5, and 6 degrees, which really would have resulted in big parts of the globe uninhabitable during summer months, for example. So some really apocalyptic things there. But all of these commitments really rely a lot on implementation and follow through. And so while it's heartening to see things moving in the right direction, albeit too slowly, none of these commitments are going to result in real action without that follow through. And that brings us to what's happening here in the United States in Washington, D.C. We're looking at the prospect of that ever so rare action in Congress on climate. There have been 2 bills that have gotten a lot of attention this year. The federal infrastructure bill, which passed and was signed, and the Build Back Better Act, which has passed the House and now awaits action in the Senate. The infrastructure bill has some key investments in EV charging, public transit, electric school buses, and investments in the grid and R&D. But the Build Back Better Act is really where most of the major climate policy is sitting. And so we really need action coming from that as well. It would be the biggest single climate investment in US history, extending tax incentives for renewable energy, electric vehicles, home efficiency, electrification. And we're going to be fighting for its passage, and Josh will talk a little bit more about that later. So international efforts require implementation and follow through. Federal action is difficult, infrequent, and also not sufficient, in and of itself. So the important takeaway from all of this context is that what we do here in Maine is really important. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where all of the commitments and big policies and resources that are allocated that happen at the international and federal level come to actually get done and and positively affect people's lives in making our communities more resilient, having people pay less for energy, or less at the pump with an EV, and this is really where that rubber hits the road. So today we are just one day past the first anniversary of Maine's Climate Action Plan. Maine won't wait. And so I just wanted to touch a little bit on why this action plan is important. In the past 3 years, the climate conversation and the situation has changed dramatically worldwide, and here in Maine. As the Mills administration took office and the 2019 legislative session began, it was really clear that there was a lot of pent-up demand for ambitious climate policies after 8 years of an administration that frankly was hostile to climate action. And one of the most important bills passed that session was LD 1679, an act to promote clean energy jobs and to establish the Maine Climate Council. So this bill both set out statutory, legally required emissions reductions of 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And it created this new body, the Maine Climate Council, which was charged with coming up with a comprehensive state climate plan and updating that plan every 4 years. And I'll note here, and I think this is also a really important note, that this bill passed with a big bipartisan majority in the legislature. So this was not a climate action is not a partisan concern. It's something that affects all of us. So the council met first in September 2019, dozens of meetings between the full council and the committees and working groups. The scientific and technical working group produced an incredibly detailed report, which I'm actually going to put in the chat. If you haven't seen it, it is your guide to climate impacts in Maine. Almost any question that I have come across that I needed a Maine specific answer on, I was able to find in the report that you can find at this link. So So all of that work across the working groups and the full climate council, there were hundreds of people involved from all sectors of the economy, from all parts of the state, from both parties. That culminated in the release of Maine Won't Wait, the Climate Action Plan a year ago yesterday. It's a comprehensive and ambitious plan. It has 4 major goals: to reduce emissions, avoid the cost of inaction, foster economic opportunity, and advance equity. And it includes 8 strategies, which I'm gonna include here. This is a little bit of an eye-watering slide here, not to make you read it all, but just to give a sense of how ambitious in scope this plan really is. It goes beyond just renewable energy. It goes beyond just electric vehicles. It includes a lot of things that a ton of different strategies across all of these different pieces. So I will say, before we get to some of the progress that we've made on these in the past year, that this plan isn't perfect. No plan could be, but it is really a fantastic start, and it gave policymakers and advocates like us a huge amount to work with in the past year. So let's talk a little bit about the progress we've made so far. I borrowed this very snazzy slide that the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future created. It comes from, I'm going to put another link for you all in the chat here. And yeah, I think like Todd said, hopefully those are clickable, and it should open up in a browser window if you click on that. But this is a progress report was released yesterday. I realize it's probably a little bit small, but that's okay. I'm not going to cover everything on this slide. I'm going to talk through it a little bit through the lens of some of the main pillars of our climate program here at NRCM. That is energy, transportation, and buildings. So I'm going to start with transportation. It's the biggest sector source of our emissions in Maine. 54% of our emissions come from transportation. And the good news is that we are starting to make the transition from combustion vehicles to zero emission electric vehicles. There are more EVs on the road and public chargers across Maine than ever. And we also saw from the Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP, a proposed rule recently to clean up emissions from heavier duty trucks and buses. And that's being considered actually right now. And some of you on the call may have helped us contribute a comment into DEP in support of that rule. So that's an important piece there. We also saw Maine's first fully electric school bus on the road this year, which is going to save thousands of dollars a year for the school district and keep diesel exhaust out of kids' lungs. There are about 3,000 school buses in Maine, but I can assure you that the one we saw on Mount Desert Island is not going to be the last one that we see. And I actually don't have the link here handy, but there's a really great news story that one of the main TV stations did with the driver of that bus, talking about some of the benefits for him as a driver, for the kids, and for the district. Now, we need to do a lot more on transportation in addition to the EV transition to ensure we have an accessible and diverse transportation system that everyone can. Sorry, my notes are disappearing on me. That everyone can participate in and benefit from. Oh my gosh, the windows, they're all opening up. What is happening? I'm sorry, everybody. Technical difficulties. But so we need this broader look at our transportation system, a more holistic look. But speeding up the adoption of electric cars and trucks is also going to be really essential for us. Next on energy, this slide has us has it noted that we're headed towards meeting our renewable energy goals which is 80% renewables by 2030 and 100% by 2050. In the past few years, we have quadrupled solar installations in Maine. And these projects have real benefits. There was just a story a few weeks ago about the Bath School District saving $40,000 per year through a solar contract that they signed. They're not the only ones. There are a ton of these stories happening across Maine. I'll drop the link. I'll drop the link to that in the chat here. But this is real money in the pockets and the accounts of school districts, Maine businesses, and Maine families. We're also really happy to see the progress that we're making towards responsibly developed offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. That's both going to provide clean and reliable zero carbon power for Maine and the region, but also is going to create and sustain good paying jobs for our economy. Again, really important to note that the energy transition is going to, is often framed as coming with a lot of costs, but also comes with a ton of economic benefits as well. And that's especially true for offshore wind in Maine. In the building space, there's a piece of progress there on heat pumps. 40,000 heat pumps installed since 2019. 28,000 of those were installed in the past year. So that's double the installation rate of the year before. Now, electrification and sourcing energy from clean sources is really critical, but it's especially important for home heating. Given the price volatility that we're seeing from fossil fuels right now. According to the Maine Office of Public Advocate, the low-income Maine households that heat with fossil fuels have some of the highest heating energy expenditures, and those that heat with electricity have some of the lowest. So this progress on heat pumps is great news, not just for climate, but for equity as well, and we need to build on that. So there's so much more that I can mention here, and I want to make sure to save time for questions, but just a few other quick highlights. DEP has rules out on climate superpollutants, or HFCs, which in some cases capture more than 1,000 times the heat of carbon dioxide pound for pound. Yesterday, the Mills administration announced nearly $25 million to help towns and tribal governments plan for the impacts of climate and protect our infrastructure from climate impacts like increased flooding, extreme weather, and sea level rise. And there were a whole number of bills in the legislature this session as well. I'm going to put a link to a blog post that we did right at the end of the legislative session, sort of highlighting some of those if you're interested in following up. But that included some reforms to the Public Utilities Commission, our state's chief energy regulator, and a number of other things as well, updating our building codes and all kinds of good stuff like that. So truly, the first year of Maine's Climate Action Plan has been action-packed, and necessarily so. But our work here in Maine is very far from being over. So before I turn it over to Josh, I wanted to ask folks to type into the chat which of the things that we've talked about or that you have seen as part of the Climate Action Plan are you most excited to build on next year and in the years to come. And I'll read out some of those as well as they come in. Great, from Marcia, getting people into heat pumps, offshore wind, energy improvements to low-income homes. Yeah, absolutely. And there are significant investments in low-income weatherization and electrification that are coming through the ARP funds, the American Recovery Plan, that was allocated at the end of the last legislative session. Electric vehicles, clean energy, grid infrastructure. Yes, land conservation, transportation. public transit, heat pump installation, public transit, electric trucks. Great. Home weatherization. Amazing. Yeah, and I share so much of this excitement. We are both we're both blessed and challenged with so many ways that we can both reduce our emissions at slow climate change and really benefit people in Maine. You know, I heard someone say once that that even though our fight against climate change can be anxious and can be scary and taxing, that if you ever wanted to live at a time when you really could make a difference on something that really mattered, then this is that time. And that's one of the reasons that I do this work. And I'm glad to be with you all tonight. But I'm going to turn it over to Josh now to talk a little bit about some of those key pieces of work that are still to come looking forward. So I will pass it over to you, Josh.
Great, thanks so much, Jack. Glad to see youth activism as a point of excitement as well. I've worked with a lot of youth this year on some exciting projects. So for a little bit of context, I am an outreach coordinator. So I've worked with many Mainers, likely a lot of you, both virtually and in person a couple times this year on some of our projects and outreach work. So as you can see, we've built a great foundation over the past year upon which to expand Maine's growth towards a resilient, clean energy future. We couldn't have done this without engagement across the board, from grassroots action to local governance, to the business community, to the science community, to the state legislature and beyond. The Maine Climate Action Plan was created with bipartisan input from many sectors, and its implementation must also be carried out with a whole of society approach. And I think we're well on our way here in the first year. So I want to start by highlighting some ongoing work that will be critical to our success in the long run. We can go ahead to the next slide, Jack. As directed by the Maine Climate Action Plan, a clean transportation roadmap is currently in development that will lay out a framework for the future of transportation in Maine. We had an opportunity to comment on the contents of this roadmap, and we plan to see a finalized version by the end of the year. As the most carbon polluting sector, as Jack mentioned, transportation in our state must be addressed, but it can be challenging to shift away from the gas-powered personal vehicle model that we are very accustomed to in Maine. This roadmap will be a good starting point to turn to, and we'll need to work hard to get to the 2030 transportation goals laid out in the Maine Climate Action Plan. I included on this slide an image of the Mount Desert Island electric bus. As Jack noted, it's been an incredible success this year, and it was really fun to listen to both the energy savings and also the efficiency and efficacy of the bus this last year. We've also been tracking recent offshore wind developments, as I'm sure all of you have. It's been in the news quite a lot. Maine really has enormous potential to produce our own clean energy with strong and consistent offshore winds, and recent federal efforts to expand offshore wind developments are promising. We will continue to advocate for offshore wind development with an eye towards sensible siting and environmentally sound, non-disruptive installations, such as the one pictured here, an Aquaventus project led up by Maine. It's really gorgeous in addition to being effective. Finally, on equity, equity is certainly a major focus of ours as we consider how to transition to clean energy and respond to climate change in a way that centers justice and equality. The Equity Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council will be releasing a report this month with a set of recommendations as to how the goals in the Maine Climate Action Plan must be carried out through an equity lens. We had the opportunity to comment on these recommendations, and we're going to continue to amplify them as they come out. And again, they should come out by the end of this year. We can go to the next slide now, Jack. So we're looking ahead to an action-packed state legislative session. I really love this picture of the State House. It's gorgeous. This year, we're going to be looking at bills featuring electric vehicle expansion, clean energy procurement, energy efficient affordable housing, electric grid planning, and quite a bit more. This will be a shortened session, so the need for rapid response and grassroots support will be all the greater. We're running from January to April this year in the second session of the 130th legislature. In addition to legislative work, we also know that important rulemakings across multiple state departments are coming up. Just a few weeks ago, over 200 NRCM supporters submitted comments to the Department of Environmental Protection in favor of the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which is a regulation that will drastically speed up the electrification of trucks and buses in the state. More such rules will be coming, and we need to make sure that decision makers are hearing directly from us. Alrighty, on to the next slide. So I wish I could report that the federal government has wrapped everything up neatly for the holidays, but as usual, that isn't quite the case. There have been some really exciting advances, however, listed on this slide. The Build Back Better Act, which would be the largest climate investment we've ever seen in this country if it is passed, is awaiting votes in the Senate before finalization in the House. We're hopeful that the bill will be signed into law before the new year, but it is possible that process will leak into 2022. If passed, Maine will see historic investment in electric vehicle expansion, public transit, clean energy development, climate resilience. Among others, it will establish a civilian climate corps for good union jobs for young folks in particular, focusing on climate response. So there is still time to reach out to your Congress members in the House and Senate alike to encourage them to support this legislation, and I hope you will do so. Notably, Jared Golden did not vote for the initial version of the bill, but we are hopeful that he will support the bill after it moves through the Senate. We can celebrate the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We worked hard to make sure that this bill came to fruition. It's a bipartisan infrastructure bill that will provide up to $2.4 billion to bolster Maine's infrastructure. That's billion with a B. There are some important climate provisions contained in the bill, including electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but it is really important that it's paired with the Build Back Better Act to see the greatest climate impacts in Maine. Our climate action plan is ambitious yet achievable, and as we have made clear over these past few months, we're really counting on our congressional delegation to support Maine's climate goals from Washington, D.C. with federal dollars. I also wanted to mention that the governor unveiled a new website yesterday. We can jump to the next slide, Jack, to show this new stuff. To celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the Climate Action Plan. It includes a whole lot, including the most recent scientific analysis of climate impacts in Maine. You can see here on the slide that it goes by region in Maine, and actionable things that folks can do to participate in our climate response. If you haven't had an opportunity to check that out already, I'm going to go ahead and put that link in the chat for you. It's maine.gov/climateplan. It's a really wonderful site that has already helped me answer a few questions. And one of the things that it highlights, along with the website, is a new plan to engage municipalities in climate action. It's called the Community Resilience Partnership, and it allocates $4.75 million in grants to climate initiatives conducted by municipalities and climate and tribal governments around the state. So these municipal opportunities present many chances to get involved in meaningful climate action in your very own community this year. With new funding streams coming in, it is important that we remain vigilant in regards to implementation and funding distribution. As Jack said, Maine is where the rubber actually hits the road, and the decisions we make in state will be critical over the next few years. Municipalities, state organizations, businesses, and residents will play a big role in determining where funding is allocated and ensuring that we remain on track with the goals laid out in the Maine Climate Action Plan. So for my last slide here, a little bit of a recap. There are a lot of moving pieces, and it can certainly feel like drinking through a fire hose, but I think that's mostly a good thing when we know that there is a lot that has to be accomplished. We'll be looking for grassroots support in the coming year to provide testimony for key bills, generate opinion media in favor of clean energy, apply pressure to elected officials to enact sound climate policy, submit comments for key rulemakings, attend informational webinars and actionable rallies, hopefully in person in the coming year, and get engaged in local climate and clean energy efforts, of which there will be many in the coming year. I wanted to note that over 2,200 individuals took at least one action with NRCM last year, despite barriers from the pandemic, which is pretty remarkable for me. And we're hoping to break that number in the coming year. If you haven't signed up for our Action Network, which a lot of you likely have if you're receiving our climate and clean energy emails, we do have a lot of other great programs at the Natural Resources Council of Maine as well. Please do so at the link that I just put in the chat. I'll go ahead and drop that in. And while I do, you all know that this is an all hands on deck moment, and I really believe that we have the groundwork laid to channel our efforts towards productive solutions. I am grateful to be in this fight for climate and clean energy and a safe future for Maine with all of you, and I look forward to our work together this year. I'm going to toss it back over to Jack and Todd to get our Q&A started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Josh and Jack, for that presentation. Yeah, it's definitely heartening to see the progress that we've made in the first year of the Climate Action Plan. There's still a lot of work to do, but I think we're on a great trajectory to achieve the ambitious yet achievable goals in the climate plan. So we've got about 20 minutes, a little bit longer than 20 minutes for questions and answers. If you have a question for either Jack or Josh, you can type that question in the Q&A box. And I apologize in advance if my sound or video is a little glitchy. I'm getting some unstable internet here, and Winslow this evening, might be the weather. But let's go ahead into our questions. So let's start with the first question here from Bill Turner, who asks about the growth of offshore wind in the state of Maine. Bill points out that offshore wind is a huge opportunity, both to create new clean energy generation in Maine and create jobs. But the question is, how are we going to get Maine's lobster industry on board in support of the offshore wind industry? Many of us know that there's been some vocal opposition from the Maine lobster industry to offshore wind development. Jack, can you maybe just speak a little bit about what the offshore wind development looks like in Maine over the next 5-10 years, and how we might be able to get the lobster industry and the commercial fishing industry in general on our side on this?
Yeah, great question, Bill, and thanks, Todd. Yeah, so for folks who haven't been following the details of offshore wind development in Maine, I'll just give a little bit of context and then get to your question about the lobster industry. So in Maine, we're talking about offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And what makes the Gulf of Maine different than other places where offshore wind development is either already happened or is being planned is that the Gulf of Maine is deep water. So unlike in places where offshore wind is really well developed, like in the North Sea in Europe, or where large-scale offshore wind is being, starting to be constructed, like in southern New England, there they can fix the turbines to the bottom of the ocean. But in the Gulf of Maine, it has to be floating, and that fact sort of drives the whole rest of the set of issues. The University of Maine has been working on for more than a decade floating offshore wind platform technology. It's made of cast concrete, and it basically acts as an enormous raft to support some of these huge turbines that will be out there generating energy from the really world-class offshore wind resource that we have. It'll be no secret to Mainers and folks on the coast that it is windy out there in the Gulf of Maine. So currently there is a small scale model. That's the picture that Josh showed, actually. I think it's either 1/8 or 1/12 scale of what they think the full-size one will be. That's currently operating. There is a planned single turbine demonstration project that will be built in the next few years off of Monhegan Island. And there is also planned and this was sort of the big advancement of the past year, a research array, which is a 12 turbine, 144 megawatt research array that is going to be built about 30 miles offshore in the Gulf of Maine. And what those projects are intended to do is really help us learn everything that we need to know about floating offshore wind. There is almost no floating offshore wind built yet in the world. We would be pioneering some of those technologies and also poised to really reap a ton of the benefits from being a center of floating offshore wind development. The offshore wind development in Maine also comes in the context of the maturation of the industry here in the US as a whole. And the Biden administration's goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind, high school computer nerd, apologies, still creeps in sometimes. 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. And it's important to note that in the last legislative session, the legislature and the governor signed a moratorium on offshore wind development in state waters, which is about 3 miles from shore, exempting that single demonstration turbine project near Mohegan Island. But that's where the vast majority of lobster fishing happens. I believe that the number that I remember is 75% of lobster fishing happens in those state waters. But also, because of the size of these turbines, it's really unlikely that we're going to be building large-scale offshore wind, that close to shore. What we're really talking about in terms of a future where this is providing a good amount of wind is happening 30, 40, even 50 miles off the coast. All that development is happening in federal waters. So so it's very important for Maine to be engaged and stay at the table for the offshore wind leasing process that is going to be happening in federal waters. Because if we don't stay at the table there, then there is going to be no one who is speaking out as an advocate for Maine coastal communities, the lobster industry, among all of the other all the other fisheries, and for making sure some of the economic benefits of offshore wind land in Maine and don't just land on the North Shore of Massachusetts, for example. So I think there is truth in that there are things that we don't know about what exactly how exactly we will build out offshore wind and what are the best ways to minimize impacts to wildlife, to fisheries, all of those things. But that's really what the demonstration project and the research array are designed to do, is to give Maine and Mainers and Maine constituencies the most data under our belt when we come to those federal processes, and need to ensure that developers are making the right kind of commitments, either in terms of construction or operation of some of these projects. So I think that's an ongoing conversation that we're going to have. There are a number of lobster industry representatives that are taking part in the Maine offshore wind roadmap process, as well as some of the energy working groups of the Maine Climate Council and things like that. So it's definitely an ongoing conversation. And there are some unknowns, but we're confident that we can develop offshore wind in a way that allows the coexistence of current ocean users, but also provides that big chunk of zero carbon electricity that we're going to need to meet our goals.
Great, thanks, Jack. And sticking with this offshore wind theme, there's a question here from Ernie about any, that's jumping into the next question. There's a question from Albert about bladeless wind turbines, wondering if Maine has considered the use of bladeless wind turbines that produce a little bit less energy than your typical wind turbine with blades. Do you know if the Mills administration is considering bladeless wind turbines in their build out of offshore wind?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that the Mills administration is actually not the primary decision maker for a good chunk of offshore wind permitting. That actually happens at the federal level. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. From what I understand, almost all of the offshore wind projects have been happening using those sort of 3-bladed turbines that you all have probably seen. They're sort of an icon at this point. But yeah, I haven't heard very much about bladeless turbines as a sort of a viable sort of scalable technology. But that's a really good question.
Great. This next question is from Ernie. Question is about building codes. Has any progress been made in updating Maine's building codes to encourage the use of new materials that'll help improve energy reduce energy consumption, increase weatherization and the comfort of our homes. What's going on with building codes in the state of Maine, and how is that part of the climate action plan?
Yeah, great question, Ernie. I love building codes, and I'm proud to say that yes, there has been some progress on building codes in the last year here in Maine. In the last legislative session, the legislature passed a bill requiring the MUBEC board. Now I'm gonna struggle to remember what that is, but it's essentially running what the acronym stands for. But it's essentially it's the Maine Unified Building and Energy Code group, I believe. It's run by the state fire marshal. Anyways, they were required to update the state's building code. Now, building codes are drawn from these international sort of standard codes. And the one in Maine up until this past year, the one that was in effect up until this past year was, I believe, the 2009 code, which is starting to look pretty dusty by the time you get to 2021. So the MUBEC board adopted the 2015 code, which is a step in the right direction. But what the bill also did, which is interesting, is required the board to adopt a stretch code that municipalities could opt into. And that for that one, they adopted the 2021 International Energy Code. Now, each one of these codes generally results in a pretty significant percentage drop in energy use and operational cost for buildings. So it's pretty important. We are working with a bunch of the other sort of interested advocacy groups and stakeholders that think about buildings in Maine about what the next code adoption will be. We would like to see the 2021 code become standard for Maine. But then the question is, because there actually isn't an international code beyond 2021, there's a question about what do we ask the MUBEC board to adopt as the stretch code, and whether that's either including some of these, there's these appendices that you can adopt as well around either fully electric buildings, that zero fossil fuel buildings, net zero buildings, which is also generates electricity on site, or ones that are EV ready, for example, so have sort of beefed up electrical requirements to ensure that we can fully electrify the transportation sector and things like that. Some of those are more important in residential versus commercial buildings, which it applies to both. But I think the overall, the note that I would make about building codes, it's really important. But if we're thinking about the carbon that's coming from buildings, a lot of that is from heating, some from lighting and from cooling, less in Maine, and less as people switch to LED bulbs, which save a ton of energy versus incandescents. Is that most of that is happening in existing buildings. It's not actually how good our code is for new buildings. Obviously, that's important work that we should do, but there's just an enormous amount that we need to do to decarbonize and make more efficient the buildings that people already live and work in. One, Efficiency Maine does really incredible work. The heat pump work that Efficiency Maine has done is the envy of other states. Many states come sort of asking, how do they run their programs? How are they so effective? But there are a couple of things that we also need in the building sector. One is workforce development. Doing home retrofits is difficult work. You might be in the attic in a Tyvek suit, sweating in the middle of winter, working on someone's insulation. It's labor intensive. It's custom work. Every building and home is different. It's difficult to standardize and scale, and so we just need a lot to get to the amount of retrofitting that we need to do and efficiency work that we need to do. We're going to need to build that workforce. we're going to also just need an infusion of resources. And that's why, the Build Back Better Act that Josh was talking about is going to be really important. It includes a lot of tax credits and rebates and things for efficiency renovations and for efficient technologies, electric home technologies. So all of those things are really important.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Build Back Better. I think this next question really gets to that. I'm going to ask Josh to respond to this next one. The question is from Liam. The question is, how can Maine collaborate with the federal government to improve our national response to climate change? As Josh mentioned in his presentation, the Build Back Better Act provides huge opportunities to respond to climate change and create jobs here in Maine. So Josh, do you want to respond to this question?
I'd love to. It's a great question, Liam. One that I've thought about a lot. As you all probably know, Maine is small but mighty in this regard. We have only 4 congressional delegates, but given the positionality of those delegates and very thin margins in our federal Congress, Maine ends up playing a really large role in a lot of these conversations, particularly with Susan Collins, Angus King, and Jared Golden. In the same token, it also means that a lot fewer constituents are able to effectuate a lot more change by reaching out to their representatives. I want to drop a quick link in the chat here that highlights some of the ways in which the recently proposed Build Back Better Act can support Maine directly. I think one of the best things we can do to influence both people in Maine and our representatives in the right direction is to highlight how Maine can most benefit from different federal initiatives. And we did that, and we've continued to do that by highlighting and uplifting voices of professionals in Maine, voices of constituents in Maine. We did a lot of video testimonial projects that allowed folks to see from a wide variety of perspectives and angles why the Build Back Better Act would be so beneficial for Maine. We've had 4 or 5 in-person rallies all the way from Caribou to Bangor to Lewiston that have been really effective, and we've generated substantive responses from congressional offices thanking us for our engagement and responding to our requests of our federal delegation. So I think it's really crucial that we continue to be engaged. The next year is an election year, and it's going to be a really crucial one for all the folks who currently represent us. And I think ongoing constituent engagement is going to be really critical. And if our work during a pandemic has been any indication, I think that our ability to maintain pressure is going to be all the greater in the coming years.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Josh. Jack, I'm going to pitch this next question over to you. The question is about biomass. Question is, a large amount of electricity in Maine is generated by biomass, which releases CO2. Should biomass be considered green energy?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that that we hear a lot, and it's important one here in Maine. So there's a couple things, probably a couple ways that you could think about the greenness or not of biomass. One is what it's actually being used for. One is, and what it's displacing or not. And one is the emissions that it creates and the other impacts of fueling it. So the argument that biomass is renewable or zero carbon is predicated on the idea that if you cut down trees to fuel either heat or electric generation, then those trees will grow back and absorb the same amount of carbon that the original trees contained. There's nothing wrong with that premise. I think where it doesn't quite line up for me is the time scale. Most of the studies that I have looked at show that the break-even point for the initial emissions from biomass, which can actually be quite high per unit of electricity generated, for example, they can in some cases be more than a coal plant, and can also come with some really significant other air pollutions, particulates, and other kinds of things, even though they don't have like sulfur necessarily and some of the other things that you get with coal. but that break-even point is somewhere in the mid 30 years. I've seen a few different studies of that or longer, and that's just not the timescale that we're working with on climate right now. We need to, we have goals of 80%. Well, I guess it sort of depends on whether you're defining this as renewable, but we need to drastically cut our carbon emissions starting soon. The longer that we wait, a 2050 goal is one thing, but we cannot wait until 2045, 2046, 2047 to start making major emissions cuts, or we're going to have some catastrophically disruptive things that will need to happen to do that. So we really need to focus on the things that keep carbon out of the air now. So there's some challenges with biomass for electricity generation. And I'll sort of set aside the conversation on carbon capture, because right now there sort of isn't a viable economic carbon capture piece of that. But that's something that often comes up as well, but I won't touch on that really right now. The other thing, though, that biomass can be used for is for heating. And there's also this question of like, well, what kind of biomass are we talking about? Are we talking about actual whole trees that are sort of going into the chipper and into the biomass plant? Or are we talking about the limbs and the roots and the tops from logging operations that are already going on to use that wood for these purposes? And we think that in some cases, if you're using it for heat specifically, that's displacing fossil fuels specifically, and that wood is sourced from waste wood and is sourced sustainably, then I think you have a real like climate argument for why biomass would be a reasonable solution or part of a mix. Now, that all of those things being said, that does not include the other issues with cutting down trees. So, habitat fragmentation, soil disruption, so other things. But just in terms of the climate and carbon scope, I think that there is a very specific lane for biomass, but I'm not sure if large scale power generation is that lane.
Great, thanks, Jack. I'm just looking at the clock. We are at 7 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of folks' time. Maybe we can get to one more question in the Q&A box. If folks have a question, if you want to type it in there, you're more than welcome to. Let's see, let's get down to a question here. I
think I can take this question from Lane.
Sure.
Todd, if that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lane asked, even if we reach carbon neutrality today, the globe will continue to warm for many hundreds of years unless we draw down the greenhouse gases. What progress has been made there? Yeah, I mean, I think those that's a little bit further on the horizon. Lane, I think there are sort of two ways to do carbon capture. Well, actually, that's not true. There's a whole bunch of them, but a few of them that I will name and sort of speak to briefly is one is capturing emissions directly at a carbon producing facility like a coal or gas plant or biomass plant or something like that, sort of that carbon capture, and then storing it in concentrated form. Mostly people have been talking about in sort of like geological features, either former oil reservoirs or salt domes and things like that. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is direct air capture, which basically just like pulls carbon slowly out of the air, concentrates it, and stores it in the same way, or sequesters it in some other way. I think the one that is most accessible, though, is natural climate solutions, sequestering carbon in healthy soils, in growing and maintaining forest cover. There's been a lot of recent research around marine carbon sequestration as well. And and I think the obvious sort of flip side of that last one is that preserving landscapes that sequester carbon is also crucially important. We want to eventually be able to pull down from one side of the ledger, but we need to stop adding to it in the first place. But I think in terms of both forestry and marine carbon sequestration, we potentially have a good deal of opportunities here in Maine to participate in some of those.
Excellent. Great. Well, thanks so much, Jack and Josh, for joining us tonight. We are past the hour, and I want to be respectful of folks' time. Thanks to everyone who tuned in this evening and for joining us. And I know that there are many folks here on this webinar who have been really active with NRCM for many years and who are very involved and focused on the development of the Climate Action Plan by the Climate Council over the years. So thank you also for your support and for speaking up in support of climate action here in Maine. Just a couple of quick reminders. As I mentioned at the start, you'll receive an email tomorrow with a recording of this program. Hope that you'll share that with your friends who are unable to join us tonight. We'll also include a few other helpful links that were shared throughout the program in that follow-up email. So that's it. Thanks very much for tuning in this evening, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again, Jack and Josh.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks all.
All right, bye-bye.